Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Yesterday, we did a video showcasing a bonkers, frankly shameful segment where Anderson Cooper chided Cornel West for accurately pointing out that the United States killed and maimed 500,000 Iraqis, saying that it was unfair to compare that to the Russian invasion of Grozny in 1999, which killed between 5,000 and 8,000. Chechens. Definitely check out that video. Anderson Cooper, former CIA intern, was in rare form. But what I found equally as interesting and eye-popping was actually before Anderson Cooper brought Cornel West on and the setup to the interview, and after the interview, and who Anderson Cooper brought on to say some crazy, ludicrous things about Cornel West, and of course, not push back on any of those crazy, ludicrous things. So let's take a look. We're going to reverse it and start with after the interview. Here is Anderson Cooper wrapping up with Cornel West and who he brought on directly after. We'll start and stop to react.
Dr. West, I appreciate your time tonight, as always.
No, indeed. Love you. Even when we disagree. Love you, man.
You take care. Joining us now, Democratic strategist James Carville, who helped Bill Clinton win the White House in 1992. James, I mean, you hear Dr. West. What is your reaction to what he had to say? Do you think he rejects the term spoiler candidate. Do you think he could be?
Well, first of all, he's obviously an accomplished scholar, academic. He seems to be a very charming man. And he's also a menace to the threat of the continued constitutional order in the United States.
Whoa. He's obviously a brilliant man, charming also, but he's a menacing threat to the constitutional order, yada, 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 by having the temerity, the gall, to exercise his right as an American. All you got to do is be 35, born in America, to run for president outside of the two-party duopoly. Now, you know, there's a lot of people who feel third parties are spoilers and peel away votes from the Democrats or the Republicans. In a little bit, I'm going to actually pop that bubble and show you why that is a lie. But how is Cornel West a menace to the Constitution and a threat to the Constitution by running for president with the Green Party? Obviously, James Carville is saying this because he's saying that Cornel West, he's already preemptively saying Cornel West is going to be responsible for electing Donald Trump by peeling away votes from Joe Biden. That is not true, and we're going to get to why that isn't true in a little bit. The data doesn't show that. The polls doesn't show that. History doesn't show that in terms of Ralph Nader, Jill Stein, etc. But he's a menace. Well, why isn't the Democratic Party a threat to the constitutional order by allowing itself, and why isn't Joe Biden a menace to the constitutional order by allowing himself to be vulnerable in the first place to a now 3-time indicted president, former president? Trump is going to be indicted over January 6th, we're learning now, for even being vulnerable at all to losing to former President Trump, who lost in 2020 and, frankly, since leaving the White House, has further disgraced himself. Why isn't President Biden and the Democratic Party abandoning promises on raising the minimum wage, abandoning promises on a public option, abandoning his promise to stop drilling on public lands, giving police more money after the mass mobilization of millions of people after George Floyd 2-3 years ago? Why isn't the Democratic Party's abandonment of its promises, abandonment of the working class, why aren't they being charged with being a menacing threat to the constitutional order? Do you think Anderson Cooper asked that? Let's continue.
And I say that because look what Ralph Nader was directly responsible for the election of George W. Bush, which brought about this horrific Iraq war and this horrific economic downturn we had, among other things. Jill Stein, who's his campaign manager, is almost certainly an agent of the Russian government. If you don't believe me, somebody at home, Google photo, General Flynn, Vladimir Putin, Jill Stein. She was hosted by the Russians prior to her running in 2016. So people are going to have to decide that we want to continue under our Constitution, because Donald Trump is telling us that very clearly, is bragging about the fact that he doesn't want to live under the Constitution anymore. And it's very clear that the only thing that Dr. West's candidacy can do is help elect Donald Trump.
Boy, we got a lot to react to. We'll get to Ralph Nader directly electing George W. Bush in a little bit, because I really want to dissect these claims about Nader, Jill Stein, etc. But CNN purports to be the worldwide leader in news, right? So you have James Carville here, legendary Democratic Party hack, with no evidence. I guess his evidence is a photo of Jill Stein in Russia at a table with Michael Flynn and Putin. Whether you don't like that or not, whether you think that's a bad look on Jill Stein's part or not, that's different than her being an agent of Russia, for which there is zero evidence of. I don't know. I didn't go to journalism school, but I kind of learned in Journalism 101 that you can't, as a journalist, you're supposed to push back if somebody makes slanderous, defamatory claims with no evidence. Of course, Anderson Cooper did not push back on that whatsoever. Jill Stein, whether you agree with her going over to Russia, taking a photo with Putin and Michael Flynn at a dinner table or not, there's zero evidence of her doing anything nefarious. I have heard her condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also offering the nuance of the lies the Soviet Union was fed, or Russia, that NATO would not encroach further east past reunified Germany. She's not a Russian agent, and shame on CNN for allowing that bullshit on its air. Let's continue.
It's nothing. I don't think any of that's inarguable, nor is it arguable that Jill Stein had deep relationships with the Russian government.
So let me ask you, because you know the argument that Ralph Nader put forward, you know the argument that Jill Stein has put forward, Dr. West mentioned it again tonight, that a lot of those people who voted for Jill Stein or Ralph Nader would not have voted for any of the mainstream candidates, and therefore they did not suck away votes from Hillary Clinton or would not hurt votes from Biden here.
Well, how could I argue with that? I'm sure that some of it's true, some of it's not true.
I mean, there's no way to know whether somebody could tell a pollster, oh, no, of course I wouldn't vote for any other candidate, but who knows who actually, how people would vote.
I can't disprove that, nor what I want to, but what I do.
You gotta love this. There's a thing that goes on with mainstream media and their selective application of certain things. So notice here, Anderson Cooper references, people say, it's not people saying, there are polls, surveys where people who voted for Jill Stein or other third-party candidates were asked, if this candidate wasn't an option, would you vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? And they said no. The majority said we would not have voted. Anderson Cooper, James Carville, well, I don't know. Maybe they were just talking, they didn't mean what they said, or maybe they would have changed their mind. Interesting that they don't believe the polls or the people who were polled in this respect, but during the Democratic primary in 2016 and 2020, when polls, almost every one in the Democratic primary, were oversampling older voters, which obviously was beneficial to Hillary Clinton in 2016, Joe Biden in 2020, but undersampling younger voters, which obviously was Bernie Sanders' base, pretty much under 40, we'll say. They ran with those polls. They believed those polls because they looked good for the establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, even to a lesser degree, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala, etc. But these surveys, these polls that do not look good for their narrative, well, how can we prove it? How do we know for sure that the people who were polled meant what they say? You got to love the consistency of corporate media. And of course, Anderson Cooper didn't challenge James Carville in defaming both Cornel West and Jill Stein. I actually asked Cornel West, do you have a response to James Carville saying you are a menacing threat to the constitutional order? Cornel West did get back. Here's what he said. Brother Carville should be ashamed of himself. Not one word of self-criticisms of his party, only scapegoating of those who reject his neoliberal friends. And he emailed it to me. So, the emphasis is on my part in trying to have a Cornel West impersonation. But he's right. There is zero self-criticism, introspection on the part of the Democratic Party. And that is by design, because they want to continue to come up with narratives of deflection, distortion, and distraction, the triple Ds. They don't want to actually look inward and say, well, why are so many Democrats considering a third party candidate? They don't want to look inward and ask, why are so many people feeling abandoned by the Democratic Party? Why are so many people feeling like Biden, even though the narrative and the branding and the marketing is the economy is doing great, historically low unemployment, blah, 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 blah. Why are people feeling they're not feeling it? We don't need to even ask those questions. We just need to fearmonger about Russia and Jill Stein being an agent. We need to, huff and puff that Cornel West merely running as a third party candidate is a menacing threat to the constitutional order of things. And of course, Andy Cooper, former CIA intern, didn't push back whatsoever. But I also want to address the beginning parts of this segment and the absolutely bullshit lies that Anderson Cooper fed to his audience, trying to frame falsely the effects of third-party candidates before even having Cornel West enter the screen. Take a look at this, and I'm going to stop and start to actually give you the facts.
Labels held a town hall this evening in New Hampshire. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin and former Utah Republican Governor John Huntsman were the headliners. Senator Manchin refusing to rule out a third-party campaign, saying, quote, if I get in a race, I'm going to win. Well, as third-party runs go, history says otherwise, but it's hard to deny there's at least some appetite among voters for alternatives to the major party frontrunners. The question is how much of an appetite and to what effect? No Labels has already drawn fire from Democrats who say all it would do is siphon off moderate voters from President Biden and put Donald Trump back in the White House. And over the years, third-party candidates have been blamed for tipping elections. Ross Perot in 1992 for taking Republican votes from President George H.W. Bush, who lost to Bill Clinton. Ralph Nader in 2000, who got nearly 100,000 votes in Florida, state that delivered the presidency to George W. Bush by fewer than 600 ballots. And in the 2016 Green Party candidate, Jill Stein, was accused of being a spoiler in several close states that Hillary Clinton narrowly lost.
So that was the bullshit he was spewing before he brought Cornel West on yesterday. And again, I encourage you to watch my video from yesterday about the exchange between Cornel West and Anderson Cooper. Anderson Cooper said some shameful, ridiculous things about the U.S. war in Iraq and minimizing the death toll in comparison to the Russian invasion and slaughter in Grozny in 1999. But first of all, what he's saying factually is not true. Data does not back it up. Facts do not back it up. Excuse me. Nothing backs it up, actually. Let me show you the actual facts, data, as far as Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, and Jill Stein. Here we go. So I was only 6 during the 1992 election, but quick Google search, you'll find all sorts of interesting facts. Ross Perot, who, by the way, got 20 million votes, got 19% of the vote in 1992. This is from the Washington Post, 1992, right after the election. Ross Perot's presence on the 1992 presidential ballot did not change the outcome of the election, according to an analysis of the second choices of Perot supporters. The analysis, based on exit polls conducted by voter research and surveys for the major news organizations, indicated that in Perot's absence, only Ohio would have shifted from the Clinton column to the Bush column. This would still have left Clinton with a healthy 349 to 189 majority in the Electoral College. And even in Ohio, the hypothetical Bush margin without Perot in the race was so small that given the normal margin of error in polls, the state still might have stuck with Clinton absent the Texas billionaire. In most states, the second choices of Perot voters only reinforced the actual outcome. For example, California, New York, Illinois, and Oregon went to Clinton by large margins, and Perot voters in those states strongly preferred Clinton to Bush. Why? Because for those that were actually paying attention, President George H.W. Bush negotiated NAFTA, signed the accord with Mexico and China right before leaving the White House. Why did Ross Perot catch fire? Because he was running against NAFTA and the offshoring of jobs to Mexico and other countries. Well, if Ross Perot's main message was against NAFTA and that it was going to hurt working class, blue collar voters. He was right. And the Republican president was the one sealing the deal. Obviously, President Clinton signed it into law when he was president. They're not peeling votes away. Ross Perot is not peeling votes away from George H.W. Bush because they're voting against George H.W. Bush and voting for Ross Perot instead because of NAFTA. And according to the polls, the second choice for most of these Ross Perot voters in the critical states was Bill Clinton. No facts. Let's just spew Ross Perot cost then President George H.W. Bush the election. Now let's get to Ralph Nader, who has been shamefully mistreated and castigated as costing Al Gore the election. Not true, because Al Gore won the election. The Supreme Court criminally stole it from Al Gore, not Ralph Nader. This from The Intercept. Gore could have theoretically asked the Florida Supreme Court to order a statewide recount with more explicit standards. But he took the advice of one of his lawyers who told him that this would, quote, cause a tremendous uproar. And in any case, as the book Deadlock later put it, quote, the best Gore could hope for was a slate of disrupted electors, i.e., he might become president, but Republicans would complain about it. Thus, Gore conceded to Bush again in a speech full of high-minded rhetoric about the law and how his surrender could, quote, point us all to a new common ground. Bush officially won Florida by 537 votes and the Electoral College by 271 to 266, and went on to become one of the most catastrophic presidents in U.S. history. A year later, in November 2001, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago announced the results of an examination of all 170,000 undervotes and overvotes. NORC found that with a full statewide hand recount, Gore would have won Florida under every possible vote standard. Depending on which standard was used, his margin of victory would have varied from 60 to 171 votes. That unfortunately was kind of swept under the radar in news right after 9/11. But the actual data shows Al Gore won Florida, thus Ralph Nader didn't steal anything. But you don't really hear about the Supreme Court stealing it. It was Ralph Nader. You don't really hear about Al Gore losing Tennessee, his home state. It was Ralph Nader. Data doesn't back it up. Al Gore won the election. And then, of course, the Jill Stein example, which data polls show if Jill Stein wasn't in the race, the people that voted for Jill Stein by I think it was 2/3 margin, just wouldn't have voted. It would not have tipped the election in favor of Hillary Clinton. Of course, all of these outlets have researchers, fact checkers, etc., that could easily find out this information, but they want to continue propagating the manufacturing of consent for a false narrative. Hopefully now you understand why it is so important to have growing and thriving independent media. If you can, support Status Coup as a member for $5 to $10 a month. StatusCoup.com/join. $5 to $10 a month will help support this investigative and our on-the-ground reporting.